Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.
Mr. Mitchell, thank you for being with us and taking our questions. I know that you are following very closely demonstrations in Georgia against Russian law. How do things look from the U.S.?
Well, they don't look great. I mean, I think in the long run, I'm feeling positive. The Georgian dream doesn't seem to have much of a future in Georgia, but we are seeing a sharp turn away from democracy, either towards Russia or following a Russian model. I'm not sure there's a big difference there. And in the short run, that's not good for Georgia. So the question is, can the Georgian dream continue in power through a repressive, not just a repressive law, but a repressive policy towards the demonstrators, a violently repressive policy, or will they be ousted? And of course, this is all, we have an election coming up in October, and there's an increased sense here in the US that the Georgian dream will rely on election fraud to win it. Now, it was my view 3 months ago that the Georgian dream could have simply won that election. Many Americans didn't believe that, but I believe they could. I don't believe that's true now.
In this light, and I would also agree with you, this was perception of many Georgians, even in Georgia, that GD was winning these elections mainly due to the weakness of the opposition, that the political opposition that we are talking. Then why reintroduce the Russian law when you have already had stated that you wouldn't do that? And this statement was not only in front of the electorate of the GD, but whole nation and also the West.
Well, I will answer that question, but I want to be clear about this issue, about the weakness of the opposition, because that's a trope that is often used, not inaccurately. My view is not that the opposition was weak. My view is that the opposition was identified with the UNM and with Saakashvili and the people who were around him. And as long as the Georgian dream defined the opposition that way, they had a real chance of winning. Now, my sense is that what we're seeing on the streets now is a civil society-led opposition. And if the opposition is not defined by Misha and the UNM, then they have a real chance of winning. In answer to your second question, this is something I've discussed with a lot of my Georgian friends and my American friends who follow Georgia. None of us know for sure, but I will propose a couple of ideas here. One is that, for whatever way, in whatever capacity, Russia leaned on Bidzina and said, you have to do this. I don't know that that's true, but that's certainly something we have to consider. Second, it is part of a movement that is genuinely felt in the leadership of the Georgian dream that their future does not lie with the kind of liberal European model, right? And we've seen this, for example, in their turn towards really kind of aggressive populist rhetoric around issues like LGBT rights. We saw this when Irakli Garbashvili, back when he was prime minister, spoke at the CPAC conference in Hungary. All of these things are indicators that they align themselves more with kind of an Orban, Putin, Modi side rather than, say, a liberal, Western one. Also, Trump would be in that camp as well here in the U.S. But the last possibility, which shouldn't be ruled out, is that people who pay attention to Georgia, even if they just pay a little bit of attention, know that Bidzina is the real leader of Georgia, regardless of who actually sits in the position of prime minister or other cabinet ministers. And to think about Bidzina, a couple things to keep in mind here. One, there's a certain amount of caprice. So he comes up with an idea. It may not be grounded in anything. It may just be something he floated. And second, he frequently is surrounded by yes men, people who are afraid to say no because it will jeopardize their job or their source of income or something like that. So it is not hard for me to imagine a scenario where Bidzina said, let's do this. And even though it was a terrible idea, everybody just kind of went along with it because they were afraid, which is a long way of saying, I'm not exactly sure. There are several possibilities. We may never know, but it was a bafflingly stupid decision on the part of the Georgian dream.
Do you rule out the role of, let me tell you plainly, like big money in all of this? Because, you know, the term global war party, whatever that means, came out of this conspiracy that the U.S. might have been involved in the case, Credit Suisse case, and Bidzina Ivanishvili's money, and we already heard this 2 billion, right? Which is which is already a specific amount of money that we've heard about. So what part does the money, the security of his money play in all of this, or is this not a factor at all?
I will answer that question. I just want to clarify something you said. This phrase global war party, globalist, these are all anti-Semitic buzzwords. These are all anti-Jewish buzzwords. We've heard those phrases to describe Jews before. So while I don't know if that's his intention, to these old Jewish ears, that's how it sounds. And it sounds that way to other people as well. With regards to your question, $2 billion for you or for me or for pretty much anybody who's watching this is an extraordinary amount of money, much more than we'll ever see in our lives. For Bidzina, you know, he loses $2 million, he still got $2 billion, sorry, he still got 4, right? So it's not that he needs the money, but yes, I think this is, when I talk about his caprice, it's personal. So he's upset because his personal assets are frozen, and because the line between the personal and the Georgian state is very blurred. Yes, I think it's very likely that informed this decision, not this decision directly, but his anger here.
Yes, and he definitely regards this as being sanctioned by the U.S. Well, we heard James O'Brien in Georgia the other day when he said that he was shocked to see that Bidzina Ivanishvili, such a big figure in Georgia, was misinformed that there are not sanctions, like official sanctions imposed on him yet.
Well, first of all, just to be clear, I don't speak in any way for the United States government. Secondly, you know, for Bidzina, I think Bidzina, 1, interprets this as a sanction, and 2, is indeed poorly informed. So Mr. O'Brien is right about that, and so both those things can be true at the same time. I also suspect that, and I hope that the United States is considering sanctions not just on Bidzina, but on others. So we'll see what happens. But these are technically not sanctions, but it is not. You can see how Bidzina might see it that way.
Yes, and this was the first time when individual financial sanctions and bans on travel bans were mentioned so specifically by the high-ranking U.S. Official as the measures that the U.S. might be considering if the law is being pushed the way it is pushed by GD to this point. Please elaborate a little bit on that, what that means to those individuals and to the country in general, even though this is not sanctions imposed on Georgia, but of course the image of the country will be badly, it will be damaged, right, when its high officials are being sanctioned and on that list of sanctions.
That's right. And first of all, it's hard to really know for sure until we see against whom the sanctions are and what the sanctions are, right? But so for example, a travel ban to the United States, is that extended to the families of some of these people?
Yes, right? That's what we heard. That's what we heard.
So
individuals, broader sanctions.
Right. So can the son or daughter of a high-ranking person in the government go to school in the United States or something like that, right? So these are issues we just don't know yet. We'll see. We'll see how broadly it is extended. I think there is a real appetite in Washington for sanctions. You know, what this means for Georgia is a tough question. There was a period, and I'm going to get the numbers slightly wrong, but from around 2017 to even as late as 2013, till around 2020, where Georgia's image in the West was no longer kind of war-torn, corrupt, authoritarian. It was more wine, arts, culture, and that was very good for Georgia. I don't know that these sanctions will destroy that image, can destroy that image. There's no question that for most Americans, if they can find Georgia on a map, it's a small country. They assume just because of where it's located, probably all kinds of inaccurate things about it. For people who are paying attention, there is a sense in about Georgia that there is a vibrant civil society, that the Georgian people not only don't support their government, this government, but are willing to stand up against it. So a smart sanction regime can damage the leadership and without damaging the country or the people. The questions about this that come to my mind are, one, timing. Is this something that is done in response to the passage of this law a few months before the election? And if so, can we offer to loosen the sanctions if the election goes well? There has to be some incentive for the Georgian government going into the October elections to conduct the elections freely and fairly, and some sense that if they don't, there will be larger consequences. So that's the challenge as the United States crafts this sanction regime, all of which occurs in the large shadow of potential further Russian engagement or intervention in Georgia, which of course would be terrible for Georgia, but also something the United States does not want.
How do you see what type of watershed this Russian law might be for Georgia? And by the way, do you regard it as Russian law? Because that is how this law is perceived by many Georgians. This is how the demonstrations, the main slogan of the demonstrations is "No to Russian law." Would you say that this law is Russian?
Well, the demonstrators are in charge of the slogans, not me. But my sense is that, you can call it a Russian law, you can call it something different. It is a law of the kind we see in countries like Russia and countries aligned with Russia. And those countries are not democracies. So again, I'm not that concerned about the name. Your question was, is this a watershed moment for Georgia?
Yes. What type of watershed moment it can be for Georgia? You mentioned several things in the short part of our interview. You mentioned GD's perspective in power. We mentioned sanctions. I mean, what could this Russian law lead Georgia?
Well,
where it can lead it?
If the law is implemented successfully, it will lead to a dampening of civil society activism in Georgia, which has really been one of the foundations of whatever democratic gains or democratic achievements Georgia has made over the last 3 decades. And that would be terrible. More broadly, this is a watershed moment because since independence from the Soviet Union, Georgia has been in a cycle. And that cycle goes something like this: democratic breakthrough, followed by a kind of euphoria, followed by democratic rollback, followed by semi-authoritarian attempted consolidation, followed by regime collapse, followed by democratic breakthrough. And at the moment, the Georgian dream is somewhere, in my view, between semi-authoritarian consolidation and regime collapse. So this could be a watershed moment in that it just restarts that cycle. And that's not good for Georgia. My hope is that it's a watershed moment because it allows Georgia to break out of that cycle. And that is why the events of the next few months are so important. My view, and I've written this and I've said this publicly, is that the Georgia dream is done. They just don't know it yet. They may still be in power for another month or another year, even another few months or another year even, but they've crossed a bridge that can't be uncrossed. And they can't, it's unimaginable to me they stay in power another 5 or 10 years. But the question is, what happens next? And this movement that we see on the streets today in Georgia and Tbilisi and other cities is different than 2012, And it's different than the Rose Revolution. And the reason is, one, it's much bigger than either movement. And two, it's not led by politicians and by specifically one larger-than-life figure, whether that figure was Misha Saakashvili, Bettina Ivanishvili, or even going back in a different way to Edward Shevardnadze. So can the civil society energy break with this kind of trap of messianic individual politicians and lead Georgia from the point of democratic breakthrough instead of to democratic rollback to democratic consolidation? And I apologize for sounding like a political science professor.
Mr. Mitchell, how do you think, I mean, till this day, Georgia's political course, so to say, and economic course as well, was transatlantic integration. It was European Union, it was NATO, it was definitely the part of this Western community, right? So, what do you think? What it means for Georgia to be perceived, and the question marks towards its EU integration path, because we see that there is this opportunity window opened for Georgia right now. It can start negotiations and talks towards becoming a member of the European Union. And at this very critical moment, we see that the questions are whether Georgia wants this or not, at least whether the government wants this or not. How does this work for Georgia or against Georgia? And here I would like to highlight not only the political side of it, but also the economic side of it. Does this lead Georgia towards isolation, and what that might mean for the small country with the open economy, which is very well integrated into the world?
My sense is that in Europe, the leaders there see the problem, not Georgia, but the Georgian government. And they are not going to work with this Georgian government anymore to bring Georgia into Europe. But when a new government comes in, I suspect that direction will return, and it could even be accelerated. So I think we are past the point. For a long time, this government did the right things. They got an association agreement. They accelerated negotiations. They were moving forward. That's not true anymore. And my sense is that that is a decision that is going to stick on the part of the Georgian dream. So, but it's not as if people in Europe have given up on Georgia. There's a recognition in Europe, and certainly the United States, which here is relevant to NATO, not to the EU, because we're not part of Europe, that this is what the Georgian people want. So that remains a positive. You know, your second question is a complicated one, because the reality is that, you know, Russia is a client of China, right? And we certainly, you know, see this in this war in Ukraine, where China is backing Russia very strongly. And, you know, there are countries that do a lot of business with Russia and with China, and that is an engine of economic development. That's not the engine of economic development that the Georgian people prefer, but it's a truism. So I'm not that concerned about isolation, but I would be more specific about the possibility of economic isolation from the West if this government can stay in power, most likely with stronger backing from Russia beyond the beyond the October election.
Thank you for this answer, and thank you for your time. My last question. Two questions. The first one, from this standpoint and how the things are evolving in Georgia with these questions that we, by the way, didn't have years before when I first interviewed you. Would you say that Bettina Ivanishvili is a Russian plan for Georgia? And did you see that, like in 2012, 2013, was that obvious?
I don't know if he's a Russian plant, and I don't know that it matters. I think in 2012, 2013, 2014, the drumbeat from the opposition that Bidzina was a Russian oligarch was unhelpful because it created a narrative where the West mishandled him. Because there was, that time, a very clear opportunity where if you'd handled him right, I think things might have gone differently. But whereas he's not necessarily a Russian plant, he is someone, he is, I'm trying to say this as clearly as possible, he's kind of recovering Homo Sovieticus, right? So his understanding of the world is through a more Russian and even Soviet era lens. So, and what I'm trying to say there is that he doesn't have an organic belief in Western values, in democratic values. He has little curiosity about the West, other than, you know, France, where he has a lot of property and money. That always struck me when I spoke with him. So to some extent, it doesn't matter exactly how strong the ties are to Russia, because he clearly is moving in that direction, and that door is always open. Again, we will see what happens after the election, because you could easily imagine a situation, unfortunately, where widespread election fraud is committed. The people go on the streets like they are today, you know, at this period in Georgia, and Russia intervenes to support the Georgian dream, or Russia says, you either get these people under control or we're going to intervene. So the rabbit hole of obsessing of, you know, how much of a Russian plant is he, to me is unhelpful. And it was unhelpful messaging early in the Kvanchilashvili period as well.
Being advisor in the past, what would be your advice today?
Well, I haven't really been an advisor to the Georgian Dream for 12 years, or since the election, really. So, and there's probably a reason for that. And I probably would say go back in time and get it right. But what I would say today is you've got to do a couple of things here. What is happening on the streets of Georgia is not sustainable for Georgia or for the government. So rescind the law again, open up some dialogue, and find a way to persuade the Georgian people that you will conduct the election fairly in exchange for some guarantees that if you lose, which they will, you know, they're not harassed, expelled, arrested as they did when they won. And now they've crossed the level of criminality where they should be harassed, expelled, arrested, etc. So it's not clear. But that does, from the American perspective, what that means is that we have to provide some kind of off-ramp, not for this bill, which is a terrible piece of legislation, and you know, hopefully it will be vetoed and won't be overridden, but for the government, because if they believe that if they leave power, they're going to be arrested, imprisoned, forced out of the country, then the possibility for real violence following the election increases. Right now, I believe, if there were an election in Georgia or looking towards the October election, the Georgian Dream would get somewhere between 30 and 35%, even 40% of the vote. I don't think they're at 20%. They just don't have a majority anymore. And with, you know, even 25% of the vote, you probably get more than a third of the seats in parliament. So there's a lot of negotiation that has to happen. And how they handle those negotiations, and the hope that there's a productive role for the West in handling those negotiations, because you want to reduce the chances of violence, while at the same time kind of turning electoral defeat doesn't have to mean regime collapse, and starting from square one, as happened in the Rose Revolution and again in 2012.
But if the regime, so do you think this regime could handle EU integration in future if it is not collapsed?
I don't think, you know, a government led by Irakli Kobakhidze and Bidzina Ivanishvili has any interest whatsoever in European integration. But a government that has 5 parties in it, where the Georgian Dream is one of the biggest, but doesn't have the majority of seats and doesn't control, you know, the prime minister or any major cabinet, any power ministries, that government could bring Georgia into the European Union. You know, you don't, to be part of the EU, you don't have to have a majority that wants to be part of the consensus, unanimity, right? Think of the United States. One of our major parties really doesn't want to be in NATO. We're still in NATO, right? So it's okay, those voices that are the kind of, they're not, it's not my opinion, I don't share these views, but the kind of populist, right-wing, socially reactionary voices that the voters that are the base of Georgian Dream support are part of the Georgian nation. They're voters in Georgia. They deserve to have their voices heard, even if you or me or both of us don't agree with them. I don't think they represent a majority, and therefore I don't think they should dominate political power as they're doing now.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell, so much for this very interesting interview. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed it.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.